Hello everyone, welcome to this video where I'll be showing you how to use Flask-sqlalchemy, a Flask extension for Flask that makes it easy to interact with your database. So without any further ado, let's jump into the project and I'll show you how we do this exactly. So just a small recap from the previous example. So we have our RESTful API for our users here. Couple of notes here. We've got our configuration file where we're reading a couple of configurations from our environment variable by loading our .env. Something else is we've got our API here, but this comes from a hard-coded list of users that we've got here in our project. But we want this to come from a database. So in order to do this, we're going to install our extension, Flask-sqlalchemy, as well as create our database and connect to it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do Python 3, and then I'm going to run the application. So the application is running at port 8000, and just to make sure that everything is working correctly with our API, let's go to Postman and let's fetch all of our users. So everything is working correctly, and we want it to look exactly the same when we're finished connecting SQLAlchemy. So if I go back, I want to open a new window here and I want to install Flask-sqlalchemy. So I'm going to say poetry add Flask-sqlalchemy. So we're installing that. It's pulling in SQLAlchemy as well, and that's all we need to do. So now there is one thing that we need to do to keep things a bit cleaner, and that is create a file called extensions. And this is a Python file. So I'm going to call this extensions. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to keep things clean. And because we're going to, down the line, we're going to be using a lot of extensions from Flask, we want to keep them at one specific place that we know we can find them. So I'm going to import from Flask-sqlalchemy. I'm going to import SQLAlchemy. And what we want to do here is we want to instantiate that class. Okay. And that's it. So we don't need this file anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our main application, and here the way extensions in Flask work is you grab the extension. So ours is db, we've named it db, and there is a method called initApp, and we have to pass our application to it, and that's what we need to do. Now we need to head to our configuration file and add the connection string for the database, and that is called SQLAlchemy database _URI. Okay, and as a good practice is we want to get this from an environment variable. So we're going to say os.environ.get, and I'm going to name it the same thing here. So I'm going to go to my .env, paste that there, and then we want to add this environment variable. So I'm going to call this SQLite. If this was Postgres, we would have done Postgres here. But Postgres has users, passwords, hosts, and everything. But for we're going to keep it to SQLite because it's quite simple. Down the line, we will change our database to Postgres to be able to handle more traffic and have a more production-ready database. But for this example, it's perfectly fine to use SQLite because the API for SQLAlchemy will be the same. So all the commands we're going to run are the same. The only thing that will change is the database. So here I'm going to name it db.sqlite3. So we've got our environment variable here. It's reading into our config here, and that ends up in our application, and our database knows about it. So what we need to do now is create our database. The way we do that is There's a couple of ways, but the way we're going to do it is through the terminal. So we're going to go here, and Flask has a CLI, and it's called Flask shell. And the reason we do this and we don't open a Python repo is because this has the context of the application. So this is what we do. And we're going to say from app, which is this one here, we want to import our DB. So what we want to do here is we want to say db.create all, and that essentially creates our SQLite database here. So we're going to close this. We don't need this for now. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come and I'm going to connect to this database. You can do it with any SQL UI tool you want, or you can even do it through the terminal. For this example, I'm going to do it here through PyCharm. So I'm going to go here, and we've got the instance and we've got our database. So we're going to test the connection. It works. We're going to apply OK, and then we're going to go here, and we see there is no substantial tables, only the default table. So we're going to ignore that for now. And what we need to do is create our models. So this is where SQLAlchemy comes into play, and this is where everything becomes just a bit cleaner. So here I'm going to create a new Python package, and we're going to call it models. And this is where you're going to keep all your models. For now, we've only got our users model. So I'm going to create a Python file, and I'm going to call it users. And within this file, I will create my user model. So here I'm going to say class user, and this will extend our db.model. db is the extension that we created, and we're going to say db.model. And what we want to do here is we want to change the table name. By default, it grabs the singular name or the name of the model. So in this case, it would be user, but I like to pluralize my table names. So I'm going to say double underscore table name double underscore is equal to users. And this is something that has to do with SQLAlchemy. And that's how you override the table name. So we want to have an ID. So if we head to our users, so we had an ID, a name, an email, and an age. So we want to replicate that exactly. So like I said in my previous video, we want the ID to be auto-generated by the database. So to do that, we're going to say db.column. And this is essentially an integer. So we're going to say db.integer. And this is the primary key. So the primary key is equal to true. And to auto increment, we're going to say auto increment. And we're going to set that to true as well. So I'm going to duplicate that a couple of times. I want the name, and this is a column again. However, here it's a string. It's not the primary key, so we don't need any of this. However, we want to say nullable, and we want to set this to false, essentially meaning that the name is required. So here we're going to say email. The email is a string again. And then here, this is unique because we cannot have the same email twice. So we're going to say unique, and we're going to set that to true. Now this is not the primary key, so we're going to delete that. And then we want to do the same thing that we did previously. We're going to say nullable, and we're going to say false. We always want to have the email. And finally, we're going to say age is a column again. It's an integer. It's not the primary key. And nullable, we're going to set that to false again, because by default it's true. So we're done with our user model. So now what we want to do is we want to essentially migrate our database so we can get this user table as well. So where I'm going to go is I'm going to go to my terminal. I'm going to exit, and I'm going to say Flask shell again. And I'm going to say from app import db, and then I want to import all of my models. So I'm going to say from models, and I'm going to import my users, import user. Okay. So what we want to do here is we want to say db.create all, and this should have created our database. Okay, let's go and have a look. So if we refresh this, okay, this is the wrong database, so I'm going to delete this. So we've added the wrong database by mistake. So we're going to say data source SQLite, and we're going to say, let's have a look. So this should be instance, and then we're going to say db.sqlite3. So if we test the connection, this seems to work. Let's go here, tables, there we go. We've got our users table. So this is correct. So this one was a mistake, so we're going to just delete that, no problem. However, if we go here to our users and double click here, there is no users at all. So what we need to do is to essentially what we call seed the database. We want to seed it. We want to add some data in it. And I've created a users.sql file here, just for simplicity's sake, with all the users that we had without their ID, because the ID will be generated by our database. So here we say insert into users the name, the email, and the age. And here we've got a bunch of tuples with the name, the email, and the age of the user. So in order to do this, we could have run the script, but in order to do it in a Python kind of way, we're going to open our terminal, and we're going to do the following. So we've got our shell open. So what we want to do is we want to import the DB, but I believe we've got it here at the context. Yeah, we do have it. So we want to open this file. So I'm going to say SQL open, and then we want to specify this file. So I'm going to say users.sql, and then I'm going to say read this, and then I'm going to say statement is equal to SQL.read. Okay, so we've got a statement here, and here is our statement, which is correct. And the way we want to run this with our DB and Flask-sqlalchemy is by essentially running a raw SQL command. But before we do that, we want to import something else called text from SQLAlchemy. So I'm going to say from SQLAlchemy import text. And then we're going to say db.session.execute, and then we want to pass a text. So essentially we're converting what we've imported to a text, and then we're going to say statement and then we're running this. However, we want to commit this because this was run within a transaction. So we're going to say db.session.commit. So if we go here, here are users, they're in our database. So this might have seemed a bit complicated, and a lot of steps took place in order to seed our database. For production applications, yeah, this would be a bit cumbersome. So personally, I've created a class that essentially is a CLI tool for Flask in order to seed the database, and you do it through the SQLAlchemy ORM. But I'm going to share that in a later video. So let's keep moving with this video, and let's update our API. So what we want to do here is we want to go to, we don't need this file anymore. So this list of users, so I'm going to delete it. Okay. So we're going to head to, let's see, we're going to head to our API, and then our resources and our users. So we've deleted this, so we're going to remove this. So here, what we're doing here is we were returning our users, but it's complaining because we've actually deleted our users. So we want to kind of update this. We want to update it with the new way that we want to do it. So how do we do this? This is where SQLAlchemy comes into play. So I want to get my users from the database. So I'm going to say users is equal to user. So I'm going to import this. This is a model, okay? And we need to access the query objects because we want to query the database. So we're going to say query dot all because we want to get all the users from our database. So this is the syntax of SQLAlchemy. You access the model, you call query on it to get the query object, and then you call all to grab all the users. Now, the thing with this is we want to, if we try and use this and call this, we see object of type user is not JSON serializable. The problem with this is because Flask doesn't know how to serialize a class, and you need to tell it how to do that. In a later future video, we're going to do this with a package called class, how to serialize it into JSON, and also how to deserialize it when you're getting data from the request. So essentially, the way to validate your request and many more things. But for this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my models, my user, and what we can do here is there is a bit of a simpler way of doing this. We can use a data class, a Python data class. So we're going to say data class. We're going to import that from Python, and we are going to tell it what each row in our database means. So here we're going to say ID is an integer, and then our name is a string, our email is a string, and our age is an integer. Okay, so this should be enough. However, we need to JSONify this result, because if we try and get this again, we need to JSONify it in order to do this. So we need to say JSONify. So this is a class, a function from Flask that tries to convert the data that you pass to it and tries to convert it into JSON data. So what we're going to say here is results is equal to users. So this will be the key of our dictionary, and this will be the value. So if we go back here, we send the request, it works exactly like we did before. So How about posting data? So here we had a last user ID to get the last ID of the user. We don't need to do that anymore. Okay, we don't need to do any of these either. So what we do here is we create a new user, and this is our user class, okay? And we pass the data that we get from the request. Again, we're not gonna validate the data. We're gonna do that in a later video. But for now, we're gonna assume that the user passed the data to the request. So we're gonna say data.get the name. And here I'm gonna pass the age and the email. Okay, and this is a user object, but it's not in the database. In order to add it to the database, we have to add it to our database user session. So we call db, okay? So we're gonna import this from our extensions. We're gonna say db.session, it has a session object on it. And then we're gonna say add user. However, that is not enough. And the reason it's not enough is because this is done, so the way SQLAlchemy works is everything is done by default. If you don't change things, everything is done within a transaction. And in my personal opinion, this is how things should be done. And the reason is maybe we were adding a user and maybe we were creating a address of a user. But if you were saving each item individually, you might have inconsistencies. So for example, you might add the user to the database and then something happens and your database crashes and you've got a user in your database, but their address is missing. What you want to do that in that case is you want to have consistent data. So you want, if everything succeeds to be added to the database, either nothing to be added to the database. So that's why we do things within transactions. So in order to commit the transaction, we need to say db.session.commit. And here we're going to JSONify this thing again. JSONify, we're going to say message is equal to this. And then our user is equal to the user. Okay, so this should work fine. And if we go here, we've got James Corden, 40 years old, james@gmail.com. So if we go before we make this request, we're gonna go here. There's nobody called James Corden in our database. So even if I refresh, nothing. So if I make this request, it says user created. So if I refresh this one, here is our user in our database. Beautiful. So this is done. Now, getting a specific user. How do we do this? We don't need all of this stuff here. What we need is the user model, and then we call query on it. And because we're going to grab by the primary key, you can use get. Get expects the primary key of the model. So I'm going to say user ID. However, here we have abort. Essentially, if we don't find the user, we want to abort. But SQLAlchemy does this for us. So if we say get or 404, it will try and get the user, and if it doesn't get the user, it will throw an exception. Essentially, we'll return a 404 response. So this here is not needed, and I'll show you exactly how this is the case. So here we're going to say JSONify. We're going to say user is equal to the user. Okay, so if we go to Postman and we try and make this request, great, we get the user. If I add the user that doesn't exist, we get a 404, exactly like before. But this is handled now by our ORM, which is great. Now, for updating a user, what we can do is we can try and get the user from the database. So I'm going to delete all this stuff here. Okay, and I'm going to say user.query .get or 404, so it's exactly like before. We don't need this. And what we need to do here is we need to update our user. So because we're only sending the age, we're going to say user.age is equal to data.get, and I need the age from there. And if I duplicate that, we want the name as well. We don't want to update the email because the email should not change. Sorry, my mistake. This one should be the name. So we can change the age and the name. And what we do here is we need to commit this. So we're going to say db.session.commit. The reason is why we're not adding the user to the session is because they're already in the session. And here we're going to say JSONify. We're going to say message. And then here we're going to say user. Okay. So we've got our user. So let's go here. Let's go to put. Okay. We've got user with the ID of 4. So if we go previously here to grab that user is Jack Edwards. So if we update the user with a random name and an age, it says user updated with a random name. So if we hit the endpoint again, it has updated. If we go to our database, there you go, the random name and the age has updated. Great. And finally, for deleting a user. So we're going to try and fetch the user. So we're going to say user.query .get or 404. We're going to pass the user ID. We don't need this. We don't need this. And all we need to do is come here and say db.session.delete. So we're going to delete the user, and then we need to commit the session. Okay. We can leave this the same, but just for consistency, I'm going to change it. And I'm going to say message is equal to this. Okay. So if we go here, if we try to delete one of the users, I'm going to delete user number 1. Okay, it says user deleted. And if we go here to our database, user with ID 1 is gone. So yes, this is the way you can use SQLAlchemy. There's of course a lot of more advanced functionality that comes with it. If you want to learn more advanced features, let me know in the comment section below. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, please like, comment, share the video as it helps the channel grow so I can keep making these videos. I upload new videos every week about Python and Flask, so if you want to get notified when I do, please subscribe as well as click the notification bell so you can get notified whenever a new video is released. Thank you very much, and see you in the next one.